The mercury had already dropped 12 degrees by the time she noticed it moving. That was the thing about the worst kind of cold. It didn't announce itself. It didn't build slowly the way a storm was supposed to, the way every old-timer in Custer County said it would when the real one finally came. It simply arrived the way ruin arrives between one breath and the next, and the world on the other side of that breath was unrecognizable from the one before. She stood in the doorway of the smallest dwelling in the county on the night of January 12th, 1888, and pressed her palm flat against the interior wall. The sod was cool beneath her fingers. Not cold cool the way a stone stays warm long after the sun has left it. Outside, the wind had reached a pitch beyond sound, something that registered in the chest rather than the ears, a pressure that felt personal. The thermometer nailed to the board beside the window showed numbers she had never seen before, numbers that dropped below the last marking on the scale and kept going somewhere the glass tube couldn't follow. Inside, her children were sleeping. The fire had burned down to coals an hour ago, and the wall beneath her hand was still giving back what the earth had stored. She didn't know the word for what the wall was doing. She didn't need one. 5 months earlier, she hadn't known what a sod brick weighed. Custer County in the first week of August 1887 was a place that tested a person's willingness to believe in the future. The grass ran shoulder high across the claim, bending in slow waves when the wind moved through it, the kind of grass that made the land look alive from a distance and overwhelming up close. The sky was enormous in a way that had no equivalent back east, no frame of reference for someone who had grown up with tree lines and hills cutting the horizon into manageable pieces. Out here, the horizon was everything. It ran in every direction without interruption, a perfect circle with the viewer at its center, and the effect was less like freedom than like exposure. The feeling of being seen from all angles simultaneously with nowhere to retreat. Marta Holst climbed down from the back of a wagon she no longer owned and looked at what her husband had left her. The claim was 160 acres of unbroken Nebraska prairie. Werner had filed on it 6 months prior, paid the $18 fee at the land office in town, and done nothing else. No house, no well, no furrow cut through the sod to show even a gesture toward improvement. He had taken the filing receipt and the deed paperwork and built nothing except the legal right to stand on the land, a right that required 5 years of residency and continuous improvement to become actual ownership. He had understood the requirement. He had simply chosen not to meet it. What he left in the wagon bed fit inside a careful inventory. The cast iron cook stove, which had been her mother's. Bedding enough for 3 people. Kitchen implements, a shovel and axe, a handsaw. Dried corn and salt pork calculated generously enough for perhaps a month. And in the cloth pocket she kept pinned inside her dress, folded against her skin like a second heartbeat, $2.60. Werner had taken the draft horse 3 weeks before she arrived. He had taken $42 from the savings tin they kept beneath the floorboard of their rented room in Illinois. He had taken the plan they had made together over 2 winters of careful discussion when to file which county, how to prove up the claim, in stages how to build the house before cold came. He had taken all of it and ridden east without a word of explanation or farewell, and the absence of explanation was the cruelest part, because it left her with no argument to make, no wrong to correct, no misunderstanding to resolve. There was only the fact of his going and the fact of what remained. Lukas stood beside her in the grass and did not ask any questions. He was 6 years old, and he had learned in the preceding weeks that some questions had no good answers and that asking them only confirmed that the adults around him were as lost as he was. He held himself very still in the way children do when they are trying to be useful simply by not requiring anything. His sister Emma stood on his other side, 4 years old, and she was not holding still at all. She had her father's coloring, lighter hair, lighter eyes, and her mother's capacity for silence that was not emptiness, but rather a kind of interior weather, something moving underneath that didn't always reach the surface. She was crouched in the grass now examining something, and after a moment the sound came up from where she was kneeling, soft and repetitive. A tune without obvious words, the same four-note phrase her grandmother had sung when working inherited the way gestures are inherited. Below the level of instruction, Marta listened to her daughter hum and looked at the empty prairie and did not allow herself to calculate. Not yet. The neighbor arrived on the third day. Ernst Bergmann, who was 54 years old, built along the lines of a man who had spent decades doing work that required the whole body rather than specific muscles thick through the shoulders and narrow at the hip, with hands that had the look of tools rather than flesh. The knuckles enlarged the skin mapped with lines that had nothing to do with age. He had come to Custer County in 1878 and had not left, which, in that particular county at that particular time, represented a kind of accomplishment that required no further explanation. 9 winters, that was the credential, that was everything. He rode up to the wagon in the late afternoon, dismounted in the careful way of a man whose knees have accumulated too many memories, and walked the perimeter of the claim without being asked. He kicked at the sod in 3 or 4 places, testing the density of the root structure, assessing the grass height, reading the land the way someone reads a document they have seen many versions of before. When he came back to where Marta was standing, his expression had settled into something that was not unkindness, but was very close to finality. He told her what she was facing in the same tone a doctor uses to explain a diagnosis, not without sympathy, but without softening. A sod house required cutting roughly an acre of prairie into uniform bricks. Each brick ran about 12 inches wide, 18 inches long, and 4 inches deep, and weighed somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds, depending on moisture content. The walls needed to be 2 feet thick and 7 feet tall to provide adequate insulation through a Nebraska winter. The ridge pole, the single beam spanning the width of the structure to support the roof load, required 3 strong men to lift into position. A proper crew with horses and a breaking plow could raise a sod house in a week. A woman alone without a horse, without a plow, without hired hands, it couldn't be done. Not in time. Not before the ground froze. You have money. His voice was flat, practical, already calculating the next piece of information. Marta looked at him steadily. $2.60. He absorbed this the way a man absorbs news that confirms what he already suspected, nodding once slowly. A frame house cost $600 in lumber shipped from Iowa. A hired crew to build a sod house cost $25 minimum more if the season was late. He told her both figures not to humiliate her, but because he believed in the value of accurate information. Because he had watched people make fatal decisions based on optimistic estimates, and he did not intend to participate in that. $2.60, she repeated, not because she had forgotten the number, but because she needed him to understand that this was not approximation. This was the precise and complete figure. This was the boundary of everything possible. Ernst looked at the 2 children for a long moment. Lukas was watching him with the careful attention of a child who has learned to read adult faces for information. Emma had found a grasshopper and was following it through the grass with total absorption, entirely unbothered by a conversation about survival that was in a technical sense about her survival. Ernst looked at the girl and then looked back at Marta, and something in his face shifted. Not softening exactly, but acknowledging the specific weight of what he was about to say. Find a husband, he told her. A man with a proved-up claim would take her and the children without much hesitation. Women were scarce enough in the county that the arithmetic worked in her favor there at least. Or sell the land $20, maybe $30, to whoever was buying failed claims in the county. A man in town, he said, without naming the name directly, who had acquired 3 parcels in the past 2 years, used the money to go east before September ended, before the weather turned. I have seen what happens to newcomers who think the prairie offers second chances. He said it without drama, almost gently. It does not. It takes what you have, and then it takes what you do not have. Sell the claim. Go east. Do not let pride be the thing that kills those children. He mounted his horse. He did not look back as he rode into the grass. Marta stood beside the wagon and watched him disappear, and then Lukas came and stood next to her the way he always did when he understood something serious was happening and didn't know what to do with the understanding. His small shoulder pressed against her hip. What are we going to do? The question was barely above a whisper, but it carried the full weight of everything he had heard. She put her hand on his head. I don't know yet, she told him. It was the most honest answer she had, and honesty felt important right then. Because dishonesty, the reassuring kind, the kind designed to make a 6-year-old feel safe, required a foundation she didn't currently possess. She would have to build that too. She spent the next 3 days counting. It was a practice she had developed over years of managing household money on insufficient income. This habit of translating every variable into its smallest accountable unit. She counted their food, the corn and pork stretched carefully, perhaps 3 weeks, perhaps 22 days if she reduced portions modestly and told herself she wasn't hungry when she was. She counted the miles to town, a full day's walk each direction, which meant a supply run cost 2 days of labor minimum. She counted the weeks until first hard freeze, 12, possibly 14, if the fall ran warm, which it sometimes did and sometimes didn't, and the prairie did not negotiate on that point. She counted the money again, which took less time the third time than the first. The numbers did not resolve into survival. Ernst Bergmann had performed this same arithmetic in his head and arrived at the same result, and he had 9 winters of experience versus her 0. She didn't argue with his math was correct. But on the morning of the 3rd day, walking the claim with Lukas and Emma trailing behind her, Emma still humming, Lukas quiet and watchful, she noticed something that numbers hadn't accounted for. She stopped walking and looked down at the ground beneath her feet. The grass was not merely thick, it was dense in a way that suggested structure rather than abundance. The individual blades so close together that they formed a continuous surface rather than a collection of separate plants. She crouched and pressed her fingers into it, pushing past the blade level into the soil beneath, and felt something unexpected. The roots were not individual strands. They were a matrix, interwoven, compressed, layered across years into something that functioned more like rope than like vegetation, locking the earth into a single continuous mass. She gripped a section and pulled, and what came up was not a handful of dirt. It was a unit, a coherent block, trailing soil at its edges, but refusing to crumble, holding itself together the way something manufactured holds together with structural intent. She held it in both hands and felt its weight. 40 pounds approximately, maybe a little less. She had carried 40 pounds every working day of her adult life in various forms, the cook stove's water reservoir filled, a full bushel of wheat, a sleeping 4-year-old who refused to wake up when it was time to come inside. She could lift 40 pounds. The only question that mattered was whether she could lift it enough times. Standing in the August grass with a block of Nebraska earth in her hands, she thought about her father. Not the man he had been in his last years, diminished by the crossing and the adjustment and the particular defeat of arriving in a new country at 50 and discovering that everything you knew was wrong. She thought about the man he had been before that in the place they had come from, a small holding, few acres of moderate soil, a root cellar he had built with his own hands that had stood for 20 years without a wall shifting or a joint opening. He had cut blocks from the earth and stacked them like stone. The cold had never reached what was stored inside. She had been very young, but she remembered the cellar, the smell of it, the particular coolness that was different from the cold outside stored rather than ambient, the temperature of preservation rather than exposure. She set the block down carefully and stood up. That night, after the children slept in the wagon under the August stars that were still warm enough to be beautiful rather than threatening, Marta sat in the grass and drew figures in the dirt with a stick. She erased them and drew again. She was not educated in the formal sense. The X she made on documents in place of a signature was not a choice but a limit. But she understood spatial relationships the way people understand things they have observed carefully over time without being taught the vocabulary. She understood that a wall that was taller required more material than a wall that was shorter. She understood that a structure built partially below the surface of the ground required less above-ground wall than one built entirely on top of it. She understood that fewer bricks meant fewer trips, and fewer trips meant more time, and more time meant the difference between possible and impossible. A standard sod house 14 feet by 16 feet, walls 2 feet thick, 7 feet tall above ground, somewhere between 300 and 350 bricks. Impossible for one person in 12 weeks. But a different house, 10 feet by 12 feet, barely larger than the wagon bed, barely larger than the space 3 people actually needed to survive a winter. Not to live comfortably, but to not die. If she dug the foundation 2 feet below grade first, the walls only needed to rise 5 feet above that. The total enclosed space would be the same. The total brick count would drop to approximately 180, still an enormous number. Still a number that made the math frightening when she thought about it directly, but less frightening than 350. The ridgepole was the other problem, the one Ernst had identified as requiring 3 strong men, and he wasn't wrong about the physics. A single beam spanning 10 feet, heavy enough to support a sod roof loaded with snow, was not something one person could lift into position through brute strength. But she had watched enough construction, the corn crib her uncle built, the chicken house her neighbor put up 2 summers ago, to understand that there was more than one way to move a heavy object. She thought about the willow trees along the creek bed 3/4 of a mile away. Thin, flexible poles, each one useless for any serious structural purpose. But 3 of them lashed together with good rope was a different calculation. 3 thin poles together, each 15 pounds, could be managed by one person working with a rope system, a temporary A-frame of longer poles, a crude pulley that redirected the effort without multiplying the required force. She wasn't sure it would work. She was sure that if she didn't try, the alternative was $20 from the man in town who collected failed claims and a trip east toward a future she couldn't visualize. She erased the last drawing with her foot and went back to the wagon. Emma had curled against Lukas in sleep, one fist tucked under her chin, breathing in the slow, deliberate rhythm of children who have tired themselves out thoroughly. Marta looked at them for a moment, the fact of them, the specific weight of the obligation they represented, and then she laid down on her salt and closed her eye. Ida Schreiber arrived on the 5th day with a basket over one arm and a manner that was direct without being aggressive, a frontier version of tact that understood the necessity of pretense, while being entirely clear-eyed about what the pretense covered. She was 38, the wife of Otto Schreiber, mother of 4 children, who had made it past their first winters in Custer County, which was a statistic she was quietly and justifiably proud of. She lived 2 miles north in a frame house Otto had built with 3 neighbors in the fall of 1884. She had heard about the woman alone on the Holst claim the county was small enough that news of abandonment traveled as efficiently as news of death. And she had come prepared with eggs, a loaf of bread, and a jar of rendered lard, and she had come prepared to call it a trade. "For the mending," she said, handing over the basket. "I'm behind on it, if you have the time." Marta took the basket. Neither of them acknowledged what the transaction actually was, because acknowledging it would have required one of them to be the charitable party and the other to be the recipient of charity, and the prairie had its own sophisticated protocol for preserving the dignity of people in desperate situations, a protocol built on mutual fiction and never spoken aloud. They walked the claim together, Ida listening while Marta laid out the plan with the flat precision of someone who has rehearsed an argument against her own doubts enough times to know where the weaknesses are. The small dimensions, the sunken foundation, the bundled ridge poles, the screw cut by hand because there was no horse, no plow, no other option. When Marta finished, Ida was quiet for long enough that Marta wondered if the silence was a form of refusal. Then, "It's half the size of anything else in the county. Not a criticism, an observation, an acknowledgement of the math. You'll need 100 trips at minimum, just hauling sod, and that's with the tarp working perfectly on flat ground, which it won't be in all conditions." She paused. "What if you get sick? What if one of the children gets sick halfway through and you lose a week?" Marta didn't argue. Every one of those scenarios was real. Everyone could kill the project, and the project failing meant the same thing as never starting. "I don't have another choice," she said, and she meant it without drama as a factual assessment of her situation. "If I don't try, I lose the claim, and we have nothing to shelter through winter anyway. If I try and fail, we're in the same position. But if I try and succeed—" She stopped because she didn't want to finish that sentence in a way that sounded like confidence she didn't fully possess. Ida looked at the 2 children playing in the grass nearby. Emma was singing. Lukas was watching his mother's face with the focused attention of a boy who understood that the outcome of adult conversations had consequences for him even when he wasn't addressed directly. "I'll lend you the better spade." Ida reached into the basket and found the lard jar, held it out. "For your hands. The blisters will crack when the weather turns dry." She paused. "I can't lend you the horse. Otto needs both for harvest." She said it as an apology, which it was. "I understand." That evening, Ida rode home and told Otto what she had found on the Holst claim. Otto shook his head with the certainty of a man who has survived enough winters to know what they cost. "She'll give up before September's out. Women alone don't build houses." He said it without particular hostility, as a statement of observed fact rather than a wish. Ida wasn't certain he was wrong. She had seen something in Marta Holst's face that she didn't have an easy word for, not confidence, because confidence was a forward-looking thing, and this was something else, something that had come to terms with backward-looking things and found a way to stand up anyway. The look of someone who has already accepted the possibility of failure and decided to work in spite of it. "That woman," Ida said, "will either prove us all wrong or prove us right. Either way, we'll know by January." James Holt's name came to Marta through Ernst Bergmann's careful omission of it, the man in town who was buying failed claims, and she encountered the name attached to the face on the morning she walked to town with $2.60 to buy a window. The general store occupied the end of the single dirt street that constituted the town's main corridor, surrounded by the optimistic infrastructure of a settlement that believed itself to be becoming something, though the believing was doing more work than the evidence justified. Inside the shelves held the fundamental grammar of frontier survival: flour, salt, dried beans. Nails roped the particular assortment of goods that the gap between a human body's requirements and the prairie's indifference made necessary. Holt was behind the counter when she entered. 45 years old, with the smooth hands of a man whose labor was entirely administrative: the lifting of papers, the transfer of coin, the management of other people's desperation at arm's length. He watched her come in with the attentive patience of someone accustomed to reading the desperation of people who entered his store, which was a skill he had developed into something close to artistry. The window glass was stacked against the back wall, small rectangles of light waiting to be installed into structures that needed it. 8 inches by 12 inches, according to the handwritten and price card. $1.12. She pointed to the card, and Holt read the number aloud. She counted the coins out one by one onto the counter, which left her with $1.48, which she put back into the cloth pocket against her skin before picking up the wrapped glass. Mrs. Holst. He pronounced the name with the particular flattening of someone for whom foreign phonetics are an imposition. I heard about your situation. I heard you're building out there by yourself. He picked up the coins she had laid down one at a time slowly, as if the act of counting required concentration. 10 by 12, they tell me. Is that right? She waited for her purchase. A house that size won't hold heat through a Nebraska winter. The volume's too small and He paused, selecting his words. The construction approach you're taking well. People in your position sometimes mistake determination for competence. I've seen it before. He wrapped the glass in paper, taking his time, each fold deliberate. I could take that claim off your hands. $20, cash today. That's more than you'll have if things go the way I think they'll go. She picked up the wrapped glass. Pride is an expensive thing when it's the children who pay the price, he said almost gently. Marta walked to the door and out into the August heat, and she did not look back, and she did not acknowledge the last thing he said, except by the way she carried the glass carefully, steadily, with both hands, the way you carry something fragile and irreplaceable across a distance that could break it. Behind her, Holt stood at the counter and watched through his store window as she began the long walk back toward the claim. He was patient. He could afford patience. The claim would be available by spring. The only question was whether it would come to him through a sale or through the land office processing an abandoned filing, and either way the outcome was the same. He turned back to his ledger. She started digging the morning after she returned from town. The foundation, first 2 feet down, 10 by 12 feet, the walls of the pit braced with the first courses of sod to prevent collapse. The borrowed spade bit into August dry Nebraska earth, and the work was harder than she had calculated because August dry Nebraska earth did not yield graciously. It came up in chunks that had to be broken, further roots running through it at unexpected angles, the clay content varying from foot to foot, so that some sections loosened easily, and some sections required the spade to be driven in repeatedly before anything came free. Her hands blistered on the second day. Not the ordinary small blisters of unaccustomed work, but deep, fluid-filled pockets that formed at the base of each finger and across the palm, the body's emergency response to sustained friction. On the 4th day they broke. The skin peeled back and the raw undersurface met the spade handle, and the first morning hours of work were something she moved through by deciding that the sensation was information rather than injury, that the pain was the body registering effort rather than damage. A distinction she knew was partially fictional, But that got her through the first hour, and the first hour led to the second. By the end of the second week, the calluses had begun to form thick ridges of hardened skin, building over the broken blisters, the body's longer-term solution. They cracked along the edges when the weather turned dry, which it did in cycles, and she used Ida's lard each evening, working it into the cracks before wrapping her hands in strips of cloth, unwrapping them each morning to start again. Her back had developed an ache that was different in quality from the muscle fatigue she was accustomed to, less like exhaustion and more like a structural complaint, something in the spine itself registering objection to the repeated bending and lifting and dragging. Some mornings she could not stand fully upright until she had walked in circles for 10 minutes, coaxing the muscles back into function through movement, because staying still only made the seizing worse. She gave Lukas and Emma the larger portions at meals. She told herself she wasn't hungry. By the end of September, her dress had begun to hang differently, gathering at the shoulders where it had once fit close, and when she caught her reflection in the window glass, propped against the wagon side not yet installed, waiting for the walls to be high enough, she saw that the architecture of her face had changed the bones closer to the surface than they had been in August. Lukas worked alongside her in the ways that a 6-year-old can work that are genuinely useful rather than symbolic. He carried brush from the creek bottom, armloads of dried willow branches, and wild plum that would form the underlayer of the roof when the walls were high enough to support one. He held stakes in position while she measured with a knotted rope. He stood watch over Emma when Marta needed both hands free, which was most of the time. He was not playing at helping. He was helping in the particular way of a child who has understood that the stakes are real, and the understanding had given him a gravity that sat oddly on his small frame, and that Marta noticed in quiet moments, the way you notice a weight someone is carrying for you. Emma could not do the work Lukas could do, but she refused to be kept at a distance from it. She followed Marta along the cutting lines, picking up and handing back small items, a loose nail, a piece of rope, and things that needed to be moved 2 feet to the left. She fell asleep in the wagon during the afternoon heat and woke up and followed Marta again until dark. One evening near the end of a long day, Marta looked up from the fourth course of the east wall to see Emma pulling a sod brick across the grass. Not carrying it, she was too small to carry it. She had wedged her fingers under one edge and was dragging it toward the building site, leaning back against the weight, her small face concentrated with effort, a furrow tracing her path through the crust of dry August soil. Marta set down the trowel and went to her daughter and took the brick from her hands. She held Emma for a moment without speaking, just held her the smell of grass and dirt and the particular warm weight of a 4-year-old's body, and then set her down and went back to the wall. Emma hummed a few notes of the familiar tune and sat down cross-legged to watch. The walls rose. First course, then second. Each course was 4 inches of height, a standard sod brick laid flat. The courses staggered like brickwork to distribute weight and prevent vertical cracks from running straight through. By the end of September, the walls had reached 3 feet above the sunken floor, 12 courses, each one leveled with loose dirt packed into gaps, the root structures of neighboring courses beginning to interlock in the way that gave sod construction its unexpected strength. Biology doing structural work that no manufactured material could replicate. Standing inside the foundation pit, Marta could look out over the top of the walls at the thigh-height grass of the claim running to the horizon, and the view was so vast and so indifferent to the small rectangle of earth she was building inside it that the contrast could have felt discouraging. She didn't let it. She looked at what she had built, not at what remained. The frost came in the 3rd week of September, a thin skin of ice on the water bucket when she broke it open in the morning, the first morning that had the specific smell of approaching winter. rather than the smell of a cold night ending. She stood in the pre-dawn dark and looked at her 3-foot walls and made her adjustment. She couldn't work at the pace she had been working. She needed to work faster. She needed 4 more feet of wall. She needed a ridge pole in position. She needed rafters and roof material and a door and a window frame and a connected stove and 100 smaller things that stood between the walls she had and a structure that could be called a house. She had perhaps 6 weeks now, not 12. The prairie had moved the deadline without asking. She picked up the spade. The first climax of the construction was not the ridge pole, though that came later. It was the rain. 3 days of continuous downpour in late September that turned the Nebraska prairie into a landscape that offered no firm surface anywhere. The cut sod became waterlogged bricks that had weighed 40 pounds in dry August weather, now ran 60, and the ones already in the wall had absorbed the water through every surface. She watched the wall from inside the wagon, through the gap in the canvas where the tear had never been mended, while rain hammered the top of the canvas and Lukas slept against her with his head on her shoulder, and Emma slept on her other side. The wall sagged, not collapsed. Sag settled into itself, the courses compressing slightly under the added weight of water and their own increased mass. The corners went from square to approximate. The top course tilted inward on the north side by what she estimated was an inch, maybe 2. She watched it through the rain and calculated the weight distribution, the base width, whether the root structures had had enough time to begin their slow interpenetration. On the 4th day, the rain stopped. She climbed out and walked to the wall in boots that sank 4 inches into the mud with each step. She put her hands against the north face and pushed. The wall did not move. She put her shoulder into it and pushed harder. The wall was absolutely still. The courses had settled and compressed, and in the process had locked together more completely than they had been before the rain, the moisture activating something in the root structure, the earth consolidating around the organic matrix in a way that pure weight and drying time alone hadn't achieved. She had lost 5 days of work to the rain and its aftermath. She could not lose another 5. But the wall had held, and holding was the only thing that mattered. She picked up the spade. On an afternoon in the first week of October, with the walls at 4 feet and the light failing early, Lukas stood at the edge of the foundation pit and asked a question that had the weight of everything unsaid behind it. He was looking at the walls, not at her, when he asked it, "Is it going to be enough?" Marta thought about the 12 weeks that had become 9, that had become 6, that had become 4. She thought about the ridge pole still waiting, about the roof material stacked at the creek bottom, about the window frame she hadn't built yet, and the door she had been assembling from wagon boards at night when the light lasted long enough. She thought about the thermometer at the Bergmann farm that Ernst had mentioned once offhandedly, the lowest it had reached last January, numbers that lived outside the ordinary range of cold. She looked at her son, who was 6 years old, and asking an adult question with an adult understanding of what the answer cost. "It's going to be what it is," she told him, "and we're going to make it enough." He nodded once with the compressed gravity she had come to recognize as his particular way of accepting difficult information. Then he went to find more brush for the roof, and she went back to cutting sod, and the sun moved toward the western edge of the prairie, and the grass caught the last of it and turned briefly beautifully gold before the cold came back. The wall was at 4 feet. She needed 1 more. She had 2 weeks. She did not yet know about Karl Wendt, who had been watching from a distance and who was working up to something he didn't have words for yet. She did not know about the calendar that was already being marked 400 miles to the northwest, where a system of Arctic air was gathering mass and velocity across empty ground indifferent to anything it might encounter on the way south. She didn't know any of that. She knew the spade handle in her hands, the weight of the next brick, the measurement of the next course, the specific arithmetic of one more day. Emma's voice drifted over from near the wagon. 4 notes, the same 4 notes rising and falling in the familiar pattern that had become the soundtrack of this particular autumn, this particular impossible project, this particular bet against everything the county believed about what a woman alone could accomplish. The sound rose and the prairie absorbed it, and the wall stood at 4 feet in the last light of an October afternoon, and Marta Holst kept working until she couldn't see anymore. The 5th foot of wall was the hardest, not because the work had changed. The cutting and the hauling and the stacking were the same movements she had performed hundreds of times by now, her body having arrived at a mechanical efficiency that was the closest thing to grace available in that kind of labor. Not because the bricks were heavier, though the October air was drawing moisture out of the soil in ways that added a few pounds per brick some mornings. It was hard because the 5th foot was the foot that mattered, the foot that completed the structure's defensive logic, and the closer she got to it, the more clearly she could see all the ways it might not happen in time. October in Custer County did not ease into itself the way October did in more forgiving climates. It arrived with intention. The mornings that had been cool in the late September went hard in the first week of October frost, not just on the water bucket now, but on the grass itself, each blade encased in a thin glaze that crunched underfoot until the sun reached a sufficient angle to dissolve it, usually somewhere around mid-morning. The afternoon still held enough warmth to work without extra layers, but the warmth was borrowed, and she could feel in it the awareness that it would not be lent much longer. She had adjusted her schedule to extract every available minute of usable light. She rose before the sun and used the pre-dawn time for tasks that didn't require seeing precisely carrying brush from the creek bottom, stacking it against the building site, preparing the next day's cutting area, so the first full light hours could go entirely to brick production. She worked until the last legible gray faded from the sky, and then worked a little longer by touch, feeling the wall surface for level in the dark, the way you feel for familiar objects in an unfamiliar room. She slept 4 or 5 hours and rose and did it again. Emma's humming had become part of the rhythm of the days. She was always somewhere nearby, carrying what she could carry, watching what she couldn't help with, occasionally falling asleep in the grass, and needing to be carried to the wagon, and occasionally waking up and resuming her trailing circuit without apparent interruption. Lukas had taken on the task of monitoring the food supply with a seriousness that exceeded the assignment. He would consult the provision box each evening and report to Marta with the gravity of an accountant reviewing figures that concerned him. Dried corn reduced. Salt pork 1 more piece than he'd thought, but smaller than he remembered. He never said what the numbers implied, but she could see him performing the same arithmetic she performed, arriving at the same marginal conclusions. By the 12th of October, the wall stood at 4 feet and 2 additional courses 4 feet 8 inches. She needed 5 feet. She had perhaps 10 days before the cold would make the mortar work of packing dirt between courses unreliable, the frozen soil refusing to consolidate around the brick edges the way wet soil did. 10 days for 4 courses, which was achievable, and then the ridge pole, which was something else entirely. Karl Wendt appeared on a Tuesday afternoon without announcement, riding a horse that was past its best years, but still functional, leading a second horse hitched to a breaking plow with 1 blade that had been repaired so many times the original iron was a minor component of the total structure. He was 62 years old, and the years had arranged themselves on him in a way that suggested compression rather than diminishment. He was shorter than he had been, probably, but the shortness looked deliberate, like a tree that has grown thick rather than tall, in response to persistent wind. He had lived 4 miles south of the Holst claim alone for 4 years since his wife died of the sickness that moved through the county in the summer of 1884 and took 3 other women with her. He had been watching Marta work from a distance for weeks. Not intrusively, the prairie was open enough that anyone traveling the South Road could see the building site, but with the focused attention of a man forming a decision about something that required more than observation to resolve. He had spent a considerable amount of that time working out how to offer what he had to offer without making the offer into an insult, because he understood with the social precision that comes from decades of frontier exchange that there was a difference between help and charity, and that the difference mattered enormously to people who had been left with nothing. He reined his horse at the edge of the cut-sod field and sat there for a moment looking at the walls, looking at Marta standing next to them with the spade still in her hand before he dismounted and walked toward her with the deliberate pace of a man who had decided something and was not going to undecide it. His English carried the weight of a first language he hadn't spoken in years, words arriving intact but arranged with a care that was slightly off from native rhythm. "I watch you work," he said without preamble, nodding toward the walls. 3 weeks, 4 weeks. You cut by hand like—" He stopped, looked for the word, didn't find it, gestured instead toward the spade. "No horse, no plow. Takes too long." She waited. "I have a horse, a plow." He gestured back toward the animals. "One day I lend them to you. You use them, cut what you need." He paused. The next part came harder, not because it wasn't true, but because he was aware of how unequal the exchange was, and he needed to cover that inequality with something that looked like reciprocity. "You do washing, mending, the things my wife did. I have shirts," another pause. "I am behind on these things." The offer was wildly unequal, and they both knew it with complete clarity. One day with a horse and a proper breaking plow was worth more than a month of mending the difference between cutting enough sawn in a week by hand and cutting the same amount in 8 hours with the right equipment. He was offering her the ability to finish the house wrapped in the pretense of a transaction so that she could accept it without it being a gift, because they both understood that accepting charity outright would have required a different kind of accounting between them. Marta looked at the plow, she looked at the walls, she looked at her hands, which were functional again after weeks of enforced toughening, but which were not and could not be within any remaining time frame going to produce bricks at the rate this project now required. She had told herself on the days the work went badly that she was doing this alone, that the solitude was the proof against Ernst's dismissal, against James Holt's patience, against every person who had watched her and calculated when she would stop. But standing here with October bearing down and the wall 4 courses short of where it needed to be, she understood that the story she had told herself about solitude was only accurate in the financial and legal sense. Financially, she was alone. Legally, the claim was hers to prove up or lose. But the prairie had its own economy, and in that economy people survived or didn't based partly on whether they could accept the asymmetric generosities that neighbors extended in the disguise of transactions, and the skill of accepting without surrendering was its own form of competence. "Yes," she said. Her voice was level, the word unadorned. "I accept." The following morning, Karl arrived with both horses and the plow before the sun was fully up. What happened over the next 8 hours was something she could not have prepared herself for by description. She had understood intellectually that horse-drawn equipment would cut more ground than handwork. That was the mathematics Ernst had used to explain why 3 men and a horse could build a house in a week while 1 woman with a spade could not. But understanding the ratio in the abstract was different from watching it happen. The breaking plow went into the prairie sod and the horse leaned into its collar, and the earth simply opened long, continuous strips of root-dense material peeling back in a smooth, even ribbon, perfectly sized, perfectly cut each pass, producing a quantity that represented an hour of her previous work. And Karl made pass after pass in the systematic rows she directed, quartering the cutting field she had chosen for density and drainage. She worked behind the plow, breaking the continuous strips into individual bricks by cutting across them with the spade at measured intervals, 18 inches, 18 inches, 18 inches, a division of labor that let both of them work at full speed simultaneously without interrupting each other's rhythm. Lukas moved the finished bricks to the tarp and stacked them for hauling. Emma moved between the stacking area and the building site, too small for the heaviest work, but present in the way she was always present, her four-note tune carrying over the sound of the plow, moving through the ground. By mid-afternoon, she had more cut sod than she had produced in the entire preceding month. By late afternoon, she had enough for the remaining wall courses. Enough for the roof material, enough to bank around the exterior foundation as a supplemental insulation layer against the coming deep cold. A reserve she had not expected to have a margin that changed the calculation of survival from barely possible to something resembling adequate. Karl rode home that evening with a bundle of mended shirts and a stack of washed and folded work clothing that Marta had been completing in the evenings over the preceding week, anticipating this offer, or one like it. He did not say goodbye. He did not look back at the walls, though she saw the angle of his head shift slightly as he rode past them, just enough to register what the day had accomplished, not enough to make anything of it. She stood beside the building site and watched him ride south until the grass swallowed the shape of him, and she thought about the decision she had made that morning, the yes that had cost her the simplest version of the story she'd been telling herself. She had let someone see the gap between what she could do and what needed to be done. She had let someone step into that gap. And she was still standing here, still building the walls 2 days from their target height, and the project still entirely hers in every way that mattered. Accepting help was not the same as failing. She had needed to learn that from the outside in through the act of doing it, because there was no way to learn it from the inside out. The walls reached 5 feet on the 14th of October. She placed the last brick of the last course on the north wall in the late afternoon and stepped back into the foundation pit and looked up. The walls rose to the correct height on all 4 sides, the corners reasonably true. The courses slightly irregular in the way hand-stacked sod always was, but functionally sound. She had checked the level with a knotted cord on every 3rd course. The variations were within acceptable range. The prairie stretched beyond the wall tops in every direction, gold-brown and enormous under the pale October sky. And for the first time since August, she was not calculating what remained to be done before allowing herself to acknowledge what had been accomplished. 5 feet of wall, 2 feet thick, 183 bricks by her count, plus the extra material for banking. Lukas was sitting on the ground nearby with his knees pulled up, watching her. Emma had climbed partially up the exterior of the south wall. The roughness of the sod surface made it climbable for someone small and unafraid, and was sitting on top of it with her legs dangling. She said something in the mixture of English words and older sounds she had been assembling into her own working language since the summer, pointing at the walls, then at the sky, then at Marta. Almost a house, Marta told her. Emma considered this assessment and hummed 4 notes in apparent agreement. The ridgepole was the problem she had been postponing in her thinking since August. She had the solution. The bundled willow poles, the rope system, the A-frame approach, but having a solution and executing it were 2 separate categories of achievement, and the category she was now entering required physical precision under load conditions that she had not been able to fully test in the planning phase. You could model the physics with a stick in the dirt. You could not fully model what happened when the load twisted unexpectedly at height, and the only corrective force available was a single person's body weight and whatever grip her hands could maintain. She spent 2 days gathering willow poles from the creek bed, selecting for straightness and consistent diameter, testing each one by pressing it against the ground at an angle and leaning her weight into it, discarding the ones that flexed too much or showed lateral weakness at the junction points where branch stubs had been cut away. She ended up with 11 poles she trusted and 3 she kept as contingency. The poles she chose for the ridge beam itself were the 3 most consistent she had found, 6 feet long, roughly 1.5 inches in diameter, each one capable of bearing a modest load individually and collectively capable, when bound together tightly, of distributing a roof load across their combined cross-section. She lashed them together with rope, starting from the center and working outward in opposing spirals, the binding tight enough that the 3 poles ceased to be individually flexible and became something else, a composite member, the weaknesses of each individual piece compensated by its neighbors. She tested the assembly by suspending it between 2 sawhorses improvised from forked branches, standing in the center and bearing down with her full weight. The bundle deflected slightly. It didn't break. It didn't separate at the lashings. The A-frame support she constructed from 2 longer poles, 10-footers thicker than the ridge assembly sourced from the same creek bed on a second trip. She notched the tops to receive a crosspiece, lashed the junctions, drove the feet into the earthen floor of the foundation at angles that would bear the horizontal thrust of the ridge beam load without walking outward. She ran a loop of rope over the crosspiece at the A-frame peak, a minimal redirect, not a true mechanical advantage system, but enough to allow her to apply her body weight from below, rather than trying to lift directly overhead. On a cold morning in the 3rd week of October, with the sun not yet above the horizon and the frost still white on the sod surface, she tied one end of the hauling rope to the midpoint of the ridge assembly and took the other end in both hands. The ridge pole went up 2 feet without incident. 3 feet. She could feel the weight redistributing through the rope system, the A-frame creaking slightly against the load, but holding the redirect at the peak, working the way she had calculated it would. Her arms were burning by the time the assembly reached 4 feet, the muscles along the back of her shoulders engaging fully, the grip of her hardened hands working at their limit, the soles of her boots planted against the earthen floor at the angle that let her use her legs rather than her back. Then the lashing slipped. She felt it before she saw it, a lateral shift in the load, the rope going briefly slack and then catching differently. And when she looked up, the outermost pole of the bundle had rotated out of alignment by 3 or 4 inches, the spiral lashing she had applied so carefully having found some imperfection in the pole's surface and walked outward along it. The bundle was no longer a unified assembly. It was 3 poles held loosely at the center and diverging at one end, the outer pole hanging at a 10-degree angle from the others, and the whole thing was swinging. What she did next happened faster than deliberate thought. She released the hauling rope, accepting the immediate drop in the assembly's position as the cost of freeing both hands, and threw herself against the nearer leg of the A-frame, which had begun to shift outward under the eccentric load. Her shoulder hit the pole, and her weight drove it back toward vertical, and she held it there by the force of her body, while both her hands worked at the slept lashing, pulling the separated pole back into alignment by grip and wedging it in position with her knee while she rewrapped the rope around the assembly. The ridge beam was swinging in a slow pendulum arc. The A-frame was pressing against her shoulder with a force that made the joint ache. She got the lashing rewrapped. She got it tied off with 3 hitches, each one drawn down with the full force of her hands. She stepped back to the hauling rope and began bringing the assembly up again. At 5 feet, the A-frame cracked. The sound was clean and loud and total, the way structural failures sound a single report. Nothing like the gradual warnings that had preceded every other crisis in the construction, just the sudden fact of it. One leg of the A-frame had a flaw she had not found in her, testing a dry rot pocket, hidden under the bark at a point 3 feet from the base, and the accumulated load over the hauling time had found it. The leg gave laterally. The A-frame sagged to one side. The ridge assembly still attached to the hauling rope that was now attached to nothing load-bearing dropped. It fell onto the top of the wall, not through the wall, not past it, onto the wall top, landing across the south end with roughly half its length inside the structure and half outside, canted at an angle that made it useless as a ridge beam, but that also meant it hadn't fallen to the floor 12 feet below where it might have broken or hit one of the children or taken out a section of wall that she did not have the material or the time to rebuild. She was up the exterior earth ramp, the sloped approach she had built over the preceding weeks to allow high brick placement before the settling sound stopped. The ramp was rough and steep, and her boots found it by feel rather than sight, because her eyes were on the ridge assembly and whether it was going to shift further. She got to the wall top and moved along it on hands and knees to where the assembly lay canted against the edge, and she put her shoulder against the heavier end and her hip against the midpoint and pushed with everything she had. The assembly moved. It moved a foot. It moved another foot. It caught on a rough patch of shoe, and she changed the angle of her push, and it moved again, and then it was where it needed to be. Resting across the wall tops at both ends, not perfectly level, not perfectly centered, but structurally positioned, bearing on masonry at both contact points, rather than cantilevering into open air. She sat on the wall top. The rope had cut into her palms during the crisis, and her shoulder had taken the full weight of the A-frame's lateral fall, the joint speaking to her in a way it would continue speaking for the next 2 weeks. The sun was below the horizon, and the sky was the flat gray of early evening, and the temperature was dropping toward the numbers that had become normal. Below her, Lukas was crying. Not loudly, not helplessly. Quietly, the way he did things, with a hand pressed against his mouth and his eyes fixed on her. He had watched the A-frame fail. He had watched her fall toward it and catch it and not fall, and the watching had cost him something. She looked down at her son's upturned face in the failing light and felt the full weight of what he had been carrying all autumn, the responsibility of witnessing, which is its own kind of labor. "We're all right," she told him, her voice rougher than she intended. "The beam is up. We're almost done." She knew it wasn't entirely true. The door, the window installation, the rafters and brush and roof sewing and a dozen other steps still stood between where she was and a structure that qualified as shelter. But the ridge beam was in position. Ernst Bergmann had said it required 3 strong men, and she had put it in position alone by rope and improvisation and the willingness to take the impact with her body when the calculation failed. That was done. It wouldn't be undone. The house was finished on the 21st of October, 1887. She stood outside it in the late afternoon and looked at what she had made. 10 feet by 12 feet, walls 2 feet thick and 5 feet tall above the sunken floor. A sod roof that would leak, she had no illusions. Sod roofs leaked. It was a feature of the material and not a defect in her execution, but that would bear the load of a Nebraska winter's accumulation without catastrophic failure. One window facing south, the glass she had carried from town installed in a frame of wagon boards, the glazing compound improvised from lard and ash, that had dried hard enough to hold through at least this season. A door of the same wagon boards hung on hinges she had cut from a strip of harness leather latched from inside with a wooden bar dropped into iron brackets bent from nails. Cost $2.60. $1.12 of that for the glass. The remainder for nails and the tar paper Ida had found in the back of her barn and insisted was surplus. Everything else came from the ground. Inside the stove pulled heat from the dry wood she had scavenged and held it in the small volume of interior space, and the walls absorbed what the air didn't need. Lukas took his position near the stove with the proprietary instinct of someone who has identified the best location and intends to keep it. Emma went to the window and pressed her palms against the glass and looked out at the prairie, and then she looked back at Marta with an expression that was not quite wonder and not quite satisfaction, but something between the two, and she hummed her 4 notes once quietly, as if confirming something she had suspected. That night, for the first time since Werner had taken the horse and the savings, and the future they had planned and ridden east without turning around, Marta slept without dreaming about the things that hadn't happened yet. November arrived and the house continued to perform in ways she had hoped for, but had not been certain enough of to count on. On the first genuinely cold night, the temperature dropping to 14 degrees by morning, according to the report of a neighbor who kept a thermometer, she built a moderate fire and watched the interior temperature stabilize at 52 degrees. Cold enough to see your breath with the fire low. Warm enough to work without gloves. Warm enough to sleep without waking from the cold, which was the functional requirement, the line between survival and its absence. What she hadn't anticipated was what happened when she let the fire die overnight. She expected the interior temperature to drop steadily, tracking the exterior cold, with a lag of a few hours, the way a frame house dropped the wooden walls, offering resistance measured in minutes rather than hours. Instead, the interior temperature fell slowly to the mid-30s and stopped. Not 32, not 25, 35, 36, and there it stayed through the night, through the coldest pre-dawn hours, until she built the morning fire and brought it back up. She touched the wall surface in the morning and found it cool, not cold, still releasing something it had absorbed. The fuel lasted longer than she had projected, which was a margin she had not built into her original estimates. It was not a large margin, but it was real. Ernst came in the second week of December. She heard the horse before she saw him and was standing in the doorway when he came into view across the snow-covered claim, the first significant snow of the season, 4 inches enough to change the visual grammar of the landscape from brown to white without changing its fundamental indifference. He rode up and stopped and looked at the chimney for a moment before he dismounted. The smoke from it was thin but continuous, visible for half a mile in the still cold air. He looked at the house. Not at her at the house. At the walls, which had settled slightly under the first snow load but had not shifted or separated. At the roof, whose sod surface was white like everything else, anonymous, no different from the ground except for the vertical walls beneath it and the chimney above it. "You're still here." The observation had no inflection. He was processing information, not making a statement about how he felt about the information. "We're still here." He looked at the walls again with the particular attention of someone reassessing a conclusion they had been confident in. Then the familiar note came back into his voice, the one that had been there on the August afternoon when he'd told her to go east. Not cruelty, but something that needed the conclusion it had already reached to be correct. "This is one mild fall," he said. "Wait until January. Wait until a real storm moves through. 2 feet of sod isn't the same as 2 feet of stone. The walls are 2 feet thick. Sod is dirt with grass in it. Grass doesn't make it stone." He mounted his horse. He said it the way he said everything, as though kindness required accuracy, and accuracy required that she not mistake what she had built for what she hadn't built yet. One easy winter doesn't prove anything. Don't confuse luck with skill. He rode away without a farewell, the horse's hooves leaving small, clean punctures in the snow. She watched him go and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, a recognition that he was not entirely wrong, and that the parts of him that were wrong in a way that was going to require an event larger than a mild November to correct. The walls had held against 14 degrees, against zero. The real question was what they would do at 40 below with a full wind load, and that question had not yet been answered. She went inside and checked the fuel pile. The fuel calculation was the arithmetic she returned to more often than any other as December deepened. She had stacked twisted grass, buffalo chips, dried stalks from the claim's edge, everything combustible she had been able to collect since October, and the pile against the exterior east wall was taller than Lukas and half again as wide. She had been careful. She had not burned more than necessary on any given night, and the wall's thermal assistance had extended her supply beyond what she had originally estimated. But December had produced cold. She hadn't calibrated for sustained lows of 20 below, 25 below. One night, the neighbor's thermometer reportedly read 30 below and stayed there for 6 hours. On those nights, she burned through her fuel faster than she wanted, keeping the stove going through the long dark to prevent the interior from dropping below the range where she could guarantee the children's safety. And on those mornings, she stood outside in the gray dawn and looked at the pile and counted the days remaining in winter against the days of fuel remaining and found that the margin was thinner than she needed it to be. She spent December gathering what she could find on top of the regular work of keeping the household going. Twisted grass by the armload dried and tied into bundles that burned long and hot. Buffalo chips from the areas she had identified in the fall, the ones not yet buried under snow, dug out with the spade and stacked against the wall. By the end of the month, she had added approximately a week's worth of material to the supply, which brought the total to something in the range of 4 weeks, possibly 5 if the cold moderated. January in Nebraska could last 6 weeks of heavy burning cold. The numbers remained uncomfortable. Then the 11th of January arrived. She woke to sunlight and a temperature that felt wrong before she understood why. The interior of the house was 42 degrees cool, comfortable, the walls still radiating the modest warmth they had stored during the previous day. She opened the door and stepped outside, and the air was above freezing. 30 degrees, maybe 35. The sky was clear and pale, and the snow was softening at the edges of the roof where the sun could reach it. After weeks of cold that had required everything she had to manage, the warmth was so disorienting that she stood in the doorway for a full minute, just feeling it on her face before she moved. Across the county, people made the same adjustment in the same stunned way. The schoolhouse opened its door. Children went out without their heavy coats, their breath barely visible in the mild air. Farmers who had been housebound for weeks found excuses to drive into town, to visit neighbors, to do the outdoor tasks that the cold had been accumulating for them. The prairie looked different in the thaw, less hostile, the snow pulling back from the south-facing exposures to reveal the brown grass underneath the landscape relaxing from its held position. Lukas asked if he could go outside without his coat. She said yes and watched him run toward the fuel depot with the particular energy of a child who has been confined indoors for too long and has now been released. She spent the morning inside doing the mending work that had accumulated and found she couldn't settle to it. She went outside. The warmth was real. She could feel it against her skin, but there was something underneath the warmth that she couldn't name, a quality in the air that the old-timers described when they talked about weather that changed too fast. Nothing good comes quick was how Ernst had put it once, talking about something else entirely, but the phrase had stayed in some accessible part of her memory, and it surfaced now unbidden. The temperature had been 30 below a week ago. Now it was above freezing. That was a 60-degree swing in 7 days. And the people who had lived long on the prairie said that when the temperature moved that far that fast, it was often because something large was being loaded into the atmosphere, somewhere else pressure building behind a temporary release. She went to gather fuel. There was no logical reason to do it. Her supply was adequate for current conditions. The weather was mild and showed no visible sign of turning. Lukas was playing near the fuel pile, healthy and warm. Emma was inside singing to the cloth doll she had been carrying since Illinois. But Marta went to the places where the thaw had exposed material that had been buried under January's snowpack, and she loaded the tarp and she dragged it back and she added it to the pile. By afternoon, she had added perhaps 2 days of additional fuel. Not much, enough to notice. She stopped when the lights started to fade and went inside and built a low fire and ate with the children and banked the stove carefully and lay down to sleep. The air had that quality, the particular stillness that was not the stillness of cold, but the stillness of something holding its breath. She woke twice in the night, and both times lay quiet in the dark, listening for wind that wasn't there yet. And both times the prairie outside was absolutely silent, a silence so complete that it had texture, like a surface you could press your hand against. She slept. The morning of January 12th began with the same mild sunlight. She woke to it coming through the south window, the winter sun low but present, laying a rectangle of pale warmth across the earthen floor that shifted slowly as the morning progressed. The interior temperature had dropped overnight to 38 degrees, with the fire banked, had climbed back to 42, with the first small morning fire she built while the children slept. The walls were cool to the touch. The lard on the shelf near the stove had not hardened overnight, which it did when the interior temperature dropped below 35. Another data point, another confirmation. She made cornmeal for breakfast. Lukas ate and asked immediately to go outside with the restlessness of a child who had been granted a reprieve from winter and intended to use every minute of it. She looked at the sky through the south window. Blue clear the horizon in that direction, empty and clean. She looked at the northwest. There was a line there that hadn't been in yesterday's sky. Not low clouds, the color was wrong for clouds, too uniform, too gray-white at the edges, too dense at the center. It was narrow, still distant, still something that could have been interpreted as nothing by someone not paying attention. She was paying attention. She had been paying attention to this sky for 5 months in a way that had changed what she was capable of seeing in it. "Stay near the fuel pile," she told Lukas, pulling on his coat for him and handing him his hat. "Don't go past the east end of it. Stay where you can see the house." He promised with the particular carelessness of a child who means the promise entirely and will keep it until something more interesting requires him not to. He ran out into the mild January morning, his boots kicking up small sprays of snow from the places where it was loosening. Emma stood at the window and watched him. Marta watched the northwest line. It was larger than it had been 5 minutes ago. She was certain of this the way you are certain of things you have looked at carefully and measured against a fixed point. The rise of the terrain at the far edge of the claim, a specific contour that she knew exactly, because she had walked it, and the line was above that contour now, where it had been at it before, which meant it was not on the ground, but in the air. And it was moving at a speed that the distance made difficult to estimate, but that her body was beginning to estimate independent of her calculations. She stepped outside. The wind that had been coming gently from the south was gone. In its place was nothing, absolute stillness, the air holding itself completely still for the space of 3 or 4 breaths. And then the first touch of something from the northwest, so faint it might have been imagined cold at the edge of warm, the lightest possible advance notice. She looked at Lukas perhaps 180 yards out, bent over something near the hollow, where the buffalo chips collected completely absorbed. The stillness broke. The wind arrived without graduation. There was the stillness, and then there was the wind. And between those two states, there was no transition, no building gust, no preliminary stir, just the immediate full presence of something that had been traveling a long distance at speed and had arrived at the Holst claim without slowing for the occasion. It hit from the northwest with a force that was physical rather than meteorological, a solid pressure that leaned against everything vertical and found the gaps in everything sealed, and behind the wind came the snow, which was not falling but moving horizontally at a velocity that made the distinction between ground and air nearly meaningless. She was calling for Lukas before the first gust finished hitting her. The sound came out of her, and the wind took it immediately, not muffled, not carried away, simply erased, absorbed into the general roar, the way a single voice is absorbed into a crowd's noise, leaving no trace of having existed. She could not hear herself call. She could not see the fuel pile which had been visible 30 seconds ago. She could not see anything beyond the reach of her own arm, and even that radius was collapsing as the snow thickened around her into something less like weather and more like a substance. She stopped moving, made herself stop, which was the hardest thing she had done all autumn, because every instinct she possessed was running toward where her son had been, and every rational faculty she could still access was telling her that running blind across open ground in a whiteout was how people died 8 feet from their own front door. She had heard that story. She had not understood it until this moment, standing in the snow with her son somewhere in front of her, and the house somewhere behind her, and both of them equally invisible. The wind was from the northwest. She had been looking northwest when it hit. Lukas had been to her southeast, roughly the hollow where the chips collected sat at the east-southeast margin of the property, as she had oriented herself this morning. She turned her back to the wind, which required physical effort, the pressure of it against her coat, registering as weight rather than force. She began walking at a diagonal to what she estimated was the southeast line, counting steps from the first one, because counting was the only measurement available to her in the featureless white that had replaced the world. 30 steps, 40, 50. She reached out her left hand and moved it through the snow ahead of her as she walked, the same motion she used to feel along a dark wall for a door, and on the 53rd step, her hand found a coat. He was standing completely still, both arms pressed against his sides, his face turned away from the wind and buried against his own shoulder. When she grabbed him, he flinched, the full-body flinch of a child who has been frightened past the ability to track what is happening around him, and then he felt her hands and grabbed back with both of his and held on with the concentrated grip of someone who has found the one fixed point in a moving world and intends not to release it. She turned them back toward where the house had been, into the wind now, the snow driving against her face with a stinging force that was not cold exactly, but rather the mechanical impact of ice crystals moving at speed, and she kept her head down and walked and counted again from 1, because the count to Lukas was no longer useful, and she needed a new number to anchor herself to. Her left shoulder hit something solid on the 31st step, and she recognized it not by sight, but by the specific quality of the resistance, not the yielding resistance of a snowdrift, but the absolute stillness of a wall that was not going anywhere. She moved along the wall with her hand flat against it, feeling for the doorframe, and found it, and pulled the door open against the wind that was trying to hold it shut, and pushed Lukas through the gap and followed him in, and got the door closed and dropped the wooden bar into its brackets. The silence that replaced the storm's roar was so complete and so sudden that it registered as a physical sensation, a pressure change, the ears adjusting to quiet, the way they adjust to altitude. Emma was in the corner near the stove, with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, and her face showing the controlled blankness that four-year-olds produce when they have been frightened enough to go somewhere interior. She made a sound when she saw them that was not a word. Lukas was shaking with the fine continuous tremor of someone whose core temperature has begun to drop. His hands, when Marta stripped off his gloves, were white at the fingertips. Not the blue-white of deep frostbite, but the pale blankness of tissue that has lost circulation without yet losing function, which meant she had minutes and not a longer timeline in which to reverse it. She pulled off his outer layers and wrapped him in the blanket from the bed, and held his hands between her palms and worked them in long, steady strokes. Friction generating warmth where the body had stopped producing its own, and watched the color migrate back into his fingers from the base toward the tip over the course of 10 minutes that she did not take her eyes off. It was while she was watching his hands that she looked up and saw Emma's face. The fever was not new. That was the thing she understood immediately and retroactively. The flush had been building for days in the general winter fatigue that was easy to attribute to cold and confinement and the accumulated stress of the season. The tiredness that hadn't lifted, the cough that had seemed dry and minor. She had noted these things with the portion of her attention not occupied by fuel calculations and structural maintenance, and the 1,000 daily negotiations with scarcity, and she had filed them under the category of winter complaints rather than the category of actual illness, because the alternative categorization required resources she didn't have. Now Emma was burning. The heat came off her forehead against Marta's palm like the surface of the stove in the first minutes after the morning fire caught, not dangerously hot, but hot in a way that had nothing to do with ambient temperature. The body's own emergency response to something it was fighting. Her eyes had a brightness that was not alertness, but its fever-lit imitation, the particular sheen of a child whose interior weather has gone severe. 2 miles north, Ida Schreiber might as well have been on the surface of the moon. The world outside the door was a lethal environment. She knew this with the specificity of someone who had just walked 30 steps in it and nearly lost her son, and that had been in the first minutes of the storm before it reached its full force. Whatever was happening outside now in the darkness, that was coming down on top of the blizzard's full violence, was beyond the range of what a person could survive through will alone. There was no help to send for. There was no help available. There was only the house and what it could hold against what the storm intended. She built the fire up. Not to maximum, she was watching the fuel supply with the awareness of someone who understands that the last hour of warmth depends on the discipline of every previous hour, but enough to bring the interior temperature back toward 50, enough to take the shivering out of Lukas, who had stopped trembling in the hands, but was still running a body-wide vibration she could feel when she put her arm around him. Emma, she pulled close on the other side, the child's feverish heat, a strange counterpoint to her brother's cold-induced shaking, two opposite thermodynamic failures being managed simultaneously. The storm found its full register sometime in the middle of the afternoon and did not reduce it. The noise was the thing she had not been prepared for, not because she hadn't understood intellectually that wind at speed generates sound, but because the particular sound of 60 miles per hour sustained across an open prairie is not like any other sound she had experienced in all her years of living near weather. It was not a howl, which implies peaks and intervals. It was continuous, a roar that occupied every frequency, simultaneously vibrating the walls, the door in its frame, the south window, in its improvised glazing compound, the very air inside the structure, so that you felt it in your chest as much as you heard it with your ears. Speaking was possible only at close range and at volume. Normal indoor sounds, the creak of the stove, the children's breathing, the small domestic noises that make silence legible, were completely buried. She pressed her palm to the interior wall surface at intervals through the afternoon, the way you take a pulse, each time cool, not cold. The exterior face of that wall was exposed to a wind chill she could not calculate, and a driving snow that was packing itself against every surface and building into drifts that were beginning by late afternoon to cover the lower half of the window. The interior face was at 40 degrees approximately, which she estimated by comparison to her own skin temperature and the temperature at which water stops flowing freely, both of which she had enough experience with to use as reference points. The thermometer told her the outside temperature was below the lowest mark line. The scale ended at 40 below. Whatever the mercury was doing beyond that graduation, the glass tube couldn't report it. The fuel decision arrived at midnight. She had been tracking the stove's consumption against the remaining supply in the pile through the exterior wall, measuring the pile by reaching through the door gap as briefly as possible to probe its dimensions by touch on the two occasions she had opened the door to check whether the storm was easing. It was not easing. The wind velocity had not reduced. The snow was still coming horizontally. The gap under the door had produced a small interior drift of fine snow driven through by sheer pressure, which she had packed back with rags and which had been pushed through again by midnight. The remaining fuel would sustain a full burn for approximately 8 hours. She did not know when the storm would end. She knew that storms of this type, fast arriving full velocity, sometimes burned through in 12 hours, and sometimes ran for 36. She had no information that would allow her to predict which category this one belonged to. 8 hours of fuel at full burn, a potential 12 to 36 hours of storm remaining. If she maintained current burn rate and the storm ran longer than 8 hours, the fire would go out while the storm was still active, and the interior temperature would begin dropping toward ambient. At ambient, with a wind chill factor, she couldn't calculate the interior of a frame house would reach lethal temperatures in a few hours. The only question, was whether the sod walls would perform differently than frame walls under the same exterior conditions, and whether the difference would be sufficient. Emma was asleep against her, the fever still present, but perhaps slightly less aggressive. The child's body generating its own considerable heat, which was simultaneously a problem and a resource. Lukas was asleep on Marta's other side, his breathing regular, his color normal. The stove was running at 3/4 capacity, which she had reduced it to an hour ago in the first move toward the decision she hadn't yet fully made. She looked at the interior wall beside the bed and pressed her palm against it. 40 degrees. The same as it had been 2 hours ago. The same as it had been 4 hours ago. Outside was somewhere below 40 below zero. The differential was 80 degrees minimum, and the interior face of the wall was holding at 40. She thought about what the wall was made of, not structurally, not the way she had thought about it when she was planning and building, but materially. Earth. The earth that ran continuously from the surface of the prairie down past the frost line, down to the depth where the planet's own heat maintained a temperature that never varied regardless of what the atmosphere above it was doing. The sod bricks she had cut were connected to that thermal reservoir, had been connected to it all summer, as they absorbed heat through their grassroots surfaces, had maintained that connection through autumn, as the stored energy began its slow release. The wall was not insulating her from the outside. The wall was a conduit to something deeper and more stable than the weather. She did not know how to say this in technical language. She knew it the way she knew how to estimate a brick's weight by its feel through accumulated observation, through the experience of having pressed her hand against this wall every few hours for months. She let the fire drop to coals. The interior temperature fell, 42 degrees, 40, 38. She watched the mercury move in the small tube by the window, the instrument's needle tracking downward with the patient indifference of a measuring tool performing its function. 37, 36. She was adding blankets and coats and every layer of fabric in the structure to the pile on the bed, building a thermal envelope around the children by material accretion, since the fire was no longer doing that work. And she climbed in beside them and pulled the edges of the pile in around all three of them and lay still and watched the thermometer. 36 degrees, the mercury stopped. She watched it for 10 minutes to be certain, the kind of watching that requires the eyes to stay fixed on a single point without interpretation, just measurement. The mercury did not descend further. It oscillated within the width of a hair, subject to the minor variations of her own body heat and the children's heat and the draft patterns of the interior air, but it did not descend. Outside, somewhere below the instrument's ability to record the coldest air in the history of this county settlement, was pressing against 2 feet of Nebraska earth, and the earth was holding. Emma's breathing was ragged and fast. The fever had climbed again in the late hours. She had gone briefly delirious around 11, calling for her father in the voice. Children use for people they trust, absolutely, and who are not present, the worst kind of calling. And Marta had wetted a cloth in the water bucket. The water was liquid, the bucket had not frozen. This was itself a piece of evidence, and pressed it to her daughter's forehead, and spoken in the low, steady tone you used to reach someone who is not quite accessible. Words that were not important for their meaning, but for their continuity, the proof of presence in the dark. Lukas woke sometime after midnight and lay quiet for a while before he spoke. When he spoke, the question had the quality of something he had been holding, carefully afraid that saying it aloud would change its odds. Is Emma going to die? Marta did not look away from her daughter's face when she answered. She's fighting, and we are right here with her while she does. It was not a reassurance. It was an accurate description of the situation, which was all she had to offer and which she chose to believe was worth more than a comfortable lie. He took this in and lay back down and did not ask anything else. The hours between 2 and 5 in the morning were the hours in which time stopped functioning at its normal rate. She was aware of the storm through the wall. Not as sound exactly, since the sound had been continuous for so long that it had become a quality of the air rather than a distinct sensory input, but as a vibration, a sustained presence on the other side of the earth she had stacked with her own hands. She thought about everything the wall had been through since October, the first frosts, the December cold, the brief thaw, and now this, the event that sorted all previous winters into the category of preparation rather than experience. The wall had not been tested before tonight. It was being tested now, and her hand against its surface in the dark reported back the same information it had been reporting for hours. Cool, not cold. Giving back what it had taken in. She trusted it, not because she had calculated that she should trust it, but because she had built it, and building something teaches you its limits better than studying it from the outside ever could. She knew every brick in those walls. She knew which courses had gone in level and which had required correction. She knew where the root structures were densest and where she had compromised on material quality because she was behind on time. She knew the wall the way you know your own body, not as an abstraction, but as a specific and particular thing with a history she had participated in creating. 36 degrees held through the darkest part of the night. Dawn arrived without announcement, the way it does after the worst nights. Not with drama, but with a gradual graying of the light that came through the snow-covered window, the quality of the darkness shifting incrementally from full black towards something that was merely dim. The wind was still present, but different, not the roar of full velocity, but a lower register, the sound of a force that had spent most of what it had and was continuing by habit rather than energy. Emma's forehead was cool. Marta pressed her palm against her daughter's face and then pressed it against her own face to compare, and found that the differential had reversed. Emma was no longer the hotter surface. The fever had broken during the night, the body concluding its emergency response and releasing the elevated temperature it had been maintaining, and Emma was sleeping in the deep way of someone who has been working very hard at something invisible and has stopped. The flush was gone. Her breathing was slow and regular and unlabored. Marta lay still for a long time after she confirmed this. Lukas was sleeping. Emma was sleeping. The mercury held at 36 degrees. Outside, the wind was dropping. She could hear the difference even through the structural noise, the gusts coming less frequently, the sustained roar between them reduced. The light through the snow-covered window was brightening toward actual morning. She built a fire from the last of the prepared fuel, twisted grass and chips, the remainder of what she had gathered over the preceding weeks, every piece of it earned through specific effort on specific days she could recall. The fire caught and the temperature began to climb, and she stood at the stove and watched the mercury move back up through 38, 40, 42. The same increments she had watched it descend now reversed. She opened the door at what she estimated was mid-morning. The snow had drifted against the exterior to a depth of 4 feet at the door, a wall of packed white that she broke through with both arms and then climbed over, pulling herself up and onto the top of the drift in the brilliant, knife-edge sunlight that follows the worst storms, when the sky is scoured completely clear and the light has nothing between it and the snow to diffuse it. The brightness hit her eyes like a physical thing. She stood on top of the drift and squinted against it and looked at the claim. The prairie had been erased. There was no grass, no trail, no fence line, nothing of the landscape she had come to know through 5 months of daily exposure, only snow continuous and unbroken running to every horizon in a surface that was almost perfectly flat, except where structures had interrupted the wind's leveling work and created drifts. The sky above it was a hard, specific blue that only appears in winter, saturated and cold, the sun cutting across it at the low angle that was all this latitude permitted in January. She looked at the house. The sod walls rose from the drifts with the same organic quality they had always had, the material continuous with the earth around it, the structure looking less like something built and more like something revealed, a formation that had been there beneath the surface and been uncovered rather than erected. Snow was packed against every vertical surface to the roof line on the north and west faces, drifted to within a foot of the roof edge on the east. The chimney stood above all of it, and from the chimney rose a thin column of smoke that was not the robust smoke of a full fire, but was smoke continuous and real visible against the blue sky for as far as the still air would carry it. The walls had held. She stood on top of the drift in her boot socks. She had come outside without thinking to put on her boots, a lapse that the cold was making itself known about, and felt something that was not triumph, which is a forward-looking emotion, but something older and more specific. The satisfaction of a result that matches a calculation made under conditions of genuine uncertainty, when the calculation was made without any guarantee that the result would follow. She had not known the wall would hold. She had decided to believe it would, and then had built her decisions on that belief. And the belief had been accurate, and this particular species of vindication is different from luck. and different from confidence and is its own thing earned rather than assumed. One moment, she gave herself that. Then she went back inside to care for her children. The death toll came in pieces over the following weeks, carried by neighbors digging out and word traveling the snow-choked roads that connected the county's scattered claims like a string of interrupted sentences. 235 by the official count that circulated through the papers. Some who had studied the event afterward put the real number closer to 400, when you accounted for the farmers found frozen in their fields in late January, the children who lost enough fingers and toes that they didn't outlast the complications, the women who caught pneumonia nursing families through the aftermath in houses that never properly warmed back up. The storm acquired names that captured what it had specifically targeted: the school children's blizzard. The children's blizzard. The worst single-day weather event in the recorded history of the Great Plains. A teacher 20 miles away, 19 years old, had tied her 3 remaining students together with a length of rope and led them out into the storm toward a boarding house she could see from the school window, 82 yards a distance that on any other day represented 40 seconds of walking. The boarding house lights were visible the whole time. She lost the building in the first 30 steps and never reoriented. She survived, but lost both feet to frostbite at the ankle. The 3 children died within sight of where they had been trying to go. Peter Gruner farming. 20 miles northwest, stepped outside to check his livestock when the storm arrived. His barn was 50 feet from his door. He was found 2 days later, frozen solid 8 feet from his own house, face down in the snow, pointed in the wrong direction. The Schreiber family 12 miles north survived in a frame house that spent the night actively failing at its primary function. Ida told it 3 days after the storm, when she came to the Holst claim on skis Otto had fashioned from barrel staves, her face pale with something that was not cold. I watched ice crystals form on the inside of our walls. She said her hands wrapped around a cup of the weak coffee that was all Marta had to offer. And on the window, on the wall boards themselves, growing inward from the wood, I watched them spread like mold, and there was nothing I could do but burn more furniture and watch the fire lose. She paused, looking at the earthen wall of the room she was sitting in. We burned everything that would burn. By morning, we had nothing left. The temperature inside was 28 degrees. She set down the cup. I thought I was going to watch my children freeze in front of me while I sat there unable to stop it. Marta did not say anything for a moment. Then, but you didn't. We didn't, but not because our house protected us. Ida looked around the small room at the packed dirt floor, at the 2-foot walls at the window, whose glass had held through the night and whose improvised frame had not separated. You built the only house in this part of the county that actually worked the way a house is supposed to work. She stopped, and the stop had weight in it, the weight of a correction being made to a previously held position. I told Otto you were building a coffin for yourself and those children. I said it more than once. I know. I was wrong. 3 words flat and deliberate, the same quality of admission that cost something real rather than something ceremonial. Ernst Bergmann came to the Holst claim on the 27th of January. He had been busy since the storm ended. There were roads to dig out, neighbors to check on damage to assess, and 2 funerals to attend for deaths that had occurred in the county's frame housing stock. A family in the northwest corner, whose stove had run out of fuel 8 hours into the storm, and 3 children at a claim near the county line, whose parents had survived but whose children had not. He had walked through the aftermath of his own predictions and found them partially accurate and partially catastrophic in their inaccuracy, and the specific mechanism of that inaccuracy was something he had been working out as he moved through the county's damage. He came to the Holst claim expecting at some level to find it abandoned, a concession to probability that he had not fully surrendered, because surrendering it required also surrendering his understanding of what was and was not possible, and that understanding had been the foundation of every practical decision he had made for 9 years. The smoke from the chimney registered before anything else. He stopped his horse 20 yards out and looked at it for a long moment before he dismounted. She opened the door before he reached it. He looked at her and then at the walls and then at the drifts piled against them the way the snow had been deposited by the storm's geometry. Massive accumulations on the north and west, faces the roof nearly buried, and above the buried roof the chimney, and from the chimney the smoke. He came inside. He put his hand against the interior wall without being asked, the gesture of someone checking a specific variable. He held his hand there for several seconds. Then he took it away. "I told you those walls wouldn't hold." He said it slowly, looking at the wall rather than at her. She waited. "I told you your children would freeze." He turned and looked at Lukas, who was sitting near the stove with a piece of rope he had been plaiting, and at Emma, who was asleep on the bed with her color normal and her breathing regular, and 3 days of convalescence behind her. He looked at them for a long moment. "I built 3 houses with good crews last fall. Frame houses, proper construction by any standard I know." He paused. The words were arriving at a pace that suggested they were being examined before release. 2 of them nearly killed the families inside. The Muller family, the father lost 2 fingers to frostbite on his right hand. They burned every stick of furniture in the house, and the temperature still dropped to 20 degrees before morning. He looked back at the wall. "Your house held." The admission was complete in 3 words, not extended, not softened. A man who had spent 9 winters being right about the Nebraska plains, stating without embellishment that on this occasion he had been wrong. "I was wrong." Marta looked at him, at the white-edged beard and the oak-carved hands, in the face that had been delivering accurate assessments of hard situations for long enough that the practice had become his primary mode of engagement with the world. She could have brought forward the specific language of his august warning, which she remembered exactly every word. She could have made something of the distance between what he had predicted and what had occurred. "Would you like coffee?" she said instead. "It's not good coffee, but it's hot." Ernst Bergmann sat down at the small table and accepted the cup she set in front of him, and they sat together in the warmth of the house he had told her she couldn't build, and drank coffee that was bad but hot. And outside, the Nebraska prairie glittered under the January sun with the specific hard beauty of a landscape that has just demonstrated what it is capable of and is not apologizing for it. He stayed an hour. He asked questions about the wall thickness, about the foundation depth, about the bundled ridge poles, and why she had chosen that approach, about the decision to let the fire drop during the storm's worst hours. He asked the questions of a practitioner encountering a technique outside his experience, not the questions of a superior assessing an inferior's improvisation. When he left, he carried more uncertainty than he had arrived with, which was for Ernst Bergmann a significant form of progress. The knowledge moved through Custer County the way water moves through cracked earth, finding every available pathway, filling the spaces that were ready for it. Ida asked Marta to explain the construction principles to Otto, who came the following week with his reluctance visible but his willingness genuine. On a man who had burned his furniture to keep his family alive and had survived to reconsider his assumptions. Marta showed him the wall construction, the 2-foot thickness, that no frame house matched the sunken foundation that put the floor below the frost line, the way the courses interlocked, so that the structure's strength came from the accumulation of connections rather than from any single element. She showed him how to read sod density for cutting quality, how to select willow poles for structural bundling, how to bank the exterior base with extra material as a supplemental thermal layer. Two families came to the Holst claim in February with the same questions, three more in March. By the time the snow cover had retreated to the north-facing slopes and the creek bottom was running high with melt, and the grass was beginning its slow green return, at least 6 households in the county had either built new sod additions or modified existing structures using techniques that Marta had developed through necessity and refined through failure, and was now distributing through conversation over bad coffee at a small table in the smallest house in Custer County. She charged nothing for any of it. Ida asked why, genuinely curious, not challenging, and Marta thought about Emma's fever breaking at 3 in the morning while the mercury held at 36, and about Lukas's fingers going white in the hollow east of the claim, and about the specific arithmetic of a house that had cost $2.60 and had held against a storm that killed 235 people in buildings that cost 20 times more. No one should lose a child to cold when the ground right under their feet has everything they need to stay warm, she said. It was not a philosophical position, it was a conclusion arrived at through experience. An experience of that kind doesn't generate positions you hold. It generates things you know, and what you know you give away, because keeping it serves no one. She had not invented sod construction. It was ancient, practiced across the treeless grasslands of the interior continent by everyone who had ever lived there and needed shelter and had no trees to cut. What she had done was demonstrate, through the specific and verifiable evidence of having done it, that a woman without money, without equipment, without male assistance, could build a structure that performed better in extreme conditions than the conventional alternative built by crews of experienced men with proper tools. That was the specific contribution. That was the thing the county had not previously had proof of. James Holt never came to the Holst claim. He had calculated her failure with enough confidence that her success represented a genuine intellectual embarrassment, the kind that cannot be absorbed publicly and therefore goes underground, becomes silence, becomes subject changing, becomes the cultivation of selective attention. When customers in the store asked about the woman on the Holst claim, he talked about other things. He had moved his acquisition interest to the claims that had actually failed, the parcels that were genuinely available through abandonment or death, of which the blizzard had produced a supply sufficient to keep him occupied for the next several years. His silence was the only acknowledgement he was capable of making, and it was in its way complete. The land he had wanted was not available. The woman he had watched walk out of his store was still on it. His patience had been defeated not by any action she had taken against him, but by the simple fact of her continued existence, which was in the final accounting the most thorough kind of defeat. Spring came late that year, as though the prairie itself needed recovery time. And when it came in stages, the creek flooding its banks with snowmelt in the first week of April, the grass returning to the low exposures before the high ones, the sky losing its winter hardness and becoming something softer and more variable. Marta planted wheat in the first week of April, a small patch on the southeast quarter of the claim where the soil drainage was best. Lukas helped her open the furrows with the garden spade, working steadily alongside her in the particular way he had been working all autumn, not performing helpfulness, but actually providing it his presence, a genuine operational contribution, rather than a symbolic one. Emma walked the rows behind them and dropped seeds at intervals, singing the four-note phrase that had carried through the construction in the winter and was now becoming the soundtrack of whatever came next. The sod house stood through the spring thaw without a single wall shifting. The roof leaked when the rain ran heavy, as it always had and always would, because sod roofs leak. It is the nature of the material, not a flaw in the execution, and she had long since arranged the interior around the drip patterns, her furniture and sleeping positions calibrated to the roof's specific hydraulics. It was a skill acquired through habitation rather than design. The house was teaching her things about itself, and she was learning them. She proved up the claim in 1892, fulfilling the 5-year continuous residency requirement of the Homestead Act, and the land went into her name alone on a document she couldn't read, but whose X she made with the same hand that had cut every brick in the walls of the house she had built to make the residency possible. Werner Holst's name appeared nowhere on the title. The law was clear. The land belonged to the person who had improved it, lived on. It demonstrated the willingness to survive it. That person was Marta. She built a frame house in 1896 when the years of farming had produced enough surplus to fund the purchase of lumber shipped from Iowa, glass windows set in milled frames, a wooden floor walls made of boards that didn't grow grass in the wet springs. She built it on the same claim 60 yards east of the sod house and did not tear down what stood there. She kept it as a storage structure, then as a winter shelter for chickens, a structure that existed because she had not dismantled it and whose continued presence required no explanation from her. Lukas grew up and became capable of the full range of work the claim required. Emma grew up and learned to read English with a facility that her mother never matched, and she read to Marta in the evening, sometimes the county paper letters from distant relatives, the occasional book that came through the lending circuit that had developed among the county's farms. They both attended the schoolhouse rebuilt after the blizzard, walking the same ground that had been white and lethal in January 1888 and was brown or green or gold in every other season. In 1916, when the old sod house was finally taken down to clear the land for Lukas's growing operation, Marta was there when the walls came apart. She watched the deconstruction with the attention of someone reading a document in a language they know intimately. The sod bricks had compressed over nearly 3 decades into something denser than they had been when she cut them, the root structures having done their slow work of consolidation until the brick and the matrix were nearly indistinguishable from a continuous block of earth. Some of them had to be broken apart with the mattock rather than simply lifted. When the last interior wall was down, she walked to where the south wall had been and picked up one brick from the rubble, 50 pounds approximately, the same weight it had been in October 1887. The grass was long dead, not a trace of green remained in the organic material woven through the soil, but the roots were still there, still intact, still woven through the dark Nebraska earth in the pattern she had come to understand as structural rather than botanical. The roots that had held the wall through storms and thaws and 30 winters had not decomposed. They had become part of the earth itself, indistinguishable from it, and yet still performing in fossilized form the same function they had performed when living. She carried it to the frame house and set it on the mantel above the fireplace in the front room. People who came to the house over the following years asked about it. It was an unusual object to display, not decorative, not symbolic in any obvious way, just a dense block of old earth sitting on a mantel where other people put clocks or photographs or the small curated evidence of a life they wanted witnessed. She never explained it. If they asked, she looked at it for a moment before looking back at them. And the look was not mysterious or deliberately withholding. It was simply the look of someone for whom the explanation is so self-evident that they cannot locate the starting point of an explanation for someone who doesn't already know it. She knew what it was, The wall that was not going to hold had held. The house that everyone said would kill her children had kept them alive on the coldest night in the recorded history of the Great Plains. The thing that had been possible because she had decided to find out if it was possible sat on her mantle and weighed what it weighed and required no interpretation from her to be what it was. Marta Holst died in February 1921 at the age of 63 on the claim she had proved up 29 years before with the sod brick still on the mantle in the front room. The land went to Lukas and Emma in equal shares, the division clean and unambiguous. The claim that had been abandoned prairie when Werner Holst filed on it in 1887 was by 1921 improved land with 2 producing fields, a proper well, a barn, a chicken coop, a house, and 34 years of continuous residency by the person whose name was on the title. The sod brick stayed on the mantle. Lukas didn't move it. Emma, who had taken over the front room for her own use when Lukas built his family's house on the northern section of the claim, didn't move it either. It sat there into the next generation, and the one after that, the grass long dead, and the roots long fossilized, and the weight unchanged 50 pounds of Nebraska earth that had once been a wall that was not supposed to hold. The prairie had presented itself as an opponent in the fall of 1887 and had thrown everything it had at a woman building a house out of the ground for $2.60, and the woman had answered it with the ground itself 2 feet of it on every side, and the ground had been enough. It had always been enough. It was lying there under everyone's feet the whole time waiting to be cut and stacked and trusted, and she had been the one to trust it, and that was the whole story, and the whole story was enough.